All right, thanks. My name's Kuan. I'll just be talking about turns kind of from the perspective of routing and how that relates to OSM data. And hopefully this is coherent. Okay, so I'm going to talk about ways to describe a turn, varying ways to profile a turn in terms of like routing time, and then common edge cases with OSM data. So just to start with, I like using OSMNX as an example because it's a very easy to use tool. It's a Python library that takes OSM data and converts it into a Python networkx object. You'll see that when you download data, it takes data that looks like, it takes raw OSM data, which you see on the left, and it does a operation called simplify graph, and it simplifies the road network to just the nodes that you see on the right, which are the functional intersections that you would experience in a road where one road intersects another road. What it's really doing, if you look at any of these ways in OSM, you can see that this particular road actually has a geometry. Nodes are used interchangeably for functional intersections between, graph edges and geometric points that don't really have any sort of routing relevance, though they do help, visually demonstrate the edge. And it takes all of those intermediate nodes, prunes them away so that you just have the edges that represent true intersections. Intersecting nodes that usually are dropped, what are those like tiny points that you were seeing in that original plot? What you're often seeing are things like crosswalks that are mapped that cross the edge slightly off on all sides from an intersection node, as well as small things that may or may not be relevant based on your perspective in routing to your traffic model or however you would approach actually routing through the graph. Key amongst those are things like driveways, sidewalk entry points, which you see marked here, the ins and outs of a gas station. These are not necessarily relevant and don't need to be treated as full intersections. So these are elements that get pruned. Okay, but when you're routing from A to B, so why am I bringing all of this up? When you're routing from A to B, you need an ETA and you need a total time. And what is that total time? That total time is actually not just a function of the time it takes to move down the road. It's actually the time it takes to maneuver from one road to another road. So making a turn, moving through an intersection, that type of action. And if you were to use OSMNX, for example, and you just download a simple road network, and then you use a simple shortest path algorithm like Dijkstra or A*, but you just use it blindly on a road network, this just happens to be Portland because it has a simple road network, so it illustrates the point well. You'll see that the technical shortest path is this squiggly line on the left. That squiggly line has, I think, 3 or 4 left turns. Realistically, as a driver, you would kind of recognize that that's probably not going to be efficient. You're going to be doing a lot of yielding. So when you actually use like quote-unquote real routing engines, you see on the right with OSRM, heuristics are applied to limit the number of complicated turns or high-cost turns. You can see how I think that the OSRM one breaks it down to 1 left turn, and I think that holds true. This is, I think, Mapbox, Google, and Bing, and you can see that they all produce different routes, but when you look at them, they are all more quote-unquote reasonable than what the true shortest path is, and that's because they're trying to limit the complexity of the maneuvers required to get from A to B. Okay, so going back to what is the cost of a turn, so cost in terms of weight. So there's 2 ways to think about the cost of a turn. One is from a routing perspective, you have this concept of weight. How expensive or how much does it cost to move? Is this a hard maneuver? Is it something that we would rather not do? And then there's also cost in terms of time. How long does it take to navigate that element? How long does it take to drive down a road? How long does it take to wait at a light to make a left-hand turn? So those are 2 elements of cost. And so when we want to understand both of them, but like particularly focusing on that time element, this is really the problem, is you would ask yourself, okay, so how can I profile a particular maneuver or a particular intersection? How am I doing on time? Just want to make sure I'm okay. Okay. So this is one very initial approach. You can simplify a intersection by the crosswalks, and you can say everything inside of the crosswalks, right, that's the time that you're maneuvering, quote unquote, through the intersection. So I'm going to profile the duration to move straight, the duration to move left, the duration to move right. And I can just start assigning those flat costs. And I can say, when I maneuver from segment A to segment B through this pattern, it takes this long. When I do a left-hand turn, it takes that long. The problem with an approach like this is that it's subject to the error of the bounds that you draw. So one of the things that you might see is that, so this is what I was basically saying is, so your cost for your ETA can now be calculated as your speed on edge 1, then the speed or the time it takes to move through the intersection, and then the speed on edge 2. Similarly for speed 1 to speed edge 1 to speed edge 3, et cetera. So each direction gets a discrete cost, and you can basically isolate the cost of the turn. So what's the downside of this? The downside of this is that there's queuing. So essentially, what if your left-hand turn lane has a long wait? You're not actually calculating all of the costs on speed edge 1 and assigning it into the turn. It's getting blended and muddied into all of the speeds associated with edge 1. So it becomes harder to actually truly cost the turn, and you might undercost high-cost turns that have a lot of buildup, like left-hand turns. So you immediately might be like, okay, well, I can fix that by looking further back up the road. But the moment you start looking further back up the road, so you increase your buffer radius, you start double counting the slow speeds. So now slow speeds are building up and being priced into the cost of the turn, and they're being priced into the cost of the speed on the road. So you can see that this is a histogram of the speed observations on a segment of road approaching a high-cost turn, and you can see the bimodal distribution, so you can see the queuing of the vehicles building up. So there's the kind of weirdly philosophical question, what is the cost of the turn? Is it actually in the turn, okay, or is it on the speed of the road? So one potential solution to that is to say, forget it, I'm not costing the turn at all. I'm going to only describe a line graph, essentially. I'm going to describe every speed as the speed from A to B or the speed from segment A to C. So instead of defining the speed on this road, I only define the speed of vehicles that move from here to this road. In these types of scenarios, then you basically normalize out the costs of the turn onto the relationship between two ways. Moving a little fast, because I do have a question for everybody else at the end, anybody who's interested in this. Why is this kind of important? When you do maneuver-based costs, you can sort of naturally expose different patterns on what would be the same OSM way. So this is a perfect example on a freeway where you have an off-ramp versus a through, and you have queuing to get into the exit lane versus the through lane. So you can see that this is the same road, and you have basically one lane that's green and one lane that's red and slow. By doing a maneuver-based cost, you don't have to worry about your probe accuracy and saying, is this vehicle on this lane versus that lane, and how am I segmenting? You naturally know, because that vehicle has transitioned from segment A to segment B, that it's assigned to that maneuver cost. So what does any of this have to do with OSM? Well, all of these approaches are interesting, but they start to break apart when you have complicated intersections. The classic example is a double-loaded corridor. Double-loaded corridors here get what we call double digitized. So in this situation, you don't actually have one road and one clean intersection like I've been showing before. You actually have two traffic lights here, right? So now what happened to your queue? Your queue is being shortened to just this center lane, and you're not actually getting the true cost of the left-hand turn. So what can we do about this? Oh, and then, so surely OSM has a tagging solution for this. Yes, it does. There's a tag called dual carriageways, but it's rarely used and it's not reliable. So we really do have to rely on geometric post-processing to try to flag these things. There are a variety of solutions, and I would invite people to come talk to me about others they have. But so I categorize them as geoprocessing, heuristics, and YOLO. And all of them have edge cases and are dangerous to do blindly on production global scale data. The most common pattern that we've attempted is DB scan, and then we use heuristics as well, like skeletonization, as well as dual carriageway specific edge matching, which is when you know it's marked as a dual carriageway, you can start to do operations on that. However, tag is not reliable, so we can't stick with that. With DB scan, you can see that DB scan automatically and pretty well, with limited tuning, quickly identifies the clusters. but it fails on things like roundabouts, so it basically can't be used outside of the United States. And then there's the dream versus the reality, which is even in the United States, this is Portland, you can see that even there are very complicated intersections like here, where you actually need to cluster multiple edges. This is actually 6 separate OSM, well, functionally 6 separate ways, and they could be defined as as a single, basically, relationship, left-hand turn. Okay. And yep, and then where does this commonly happen in the United States? It's actually everywhere in the suburbs of America where you have these massive stroads that intersect. They're frequently double loaded. This is all over Long Island, for example, but you can actually see there's slip lanes, and they all need to be consolidated and simplified if we want to talk about kind of the A to B concept maneuver-based turn costing that I was describing earlier. So resolving these geometries is critical to that. So yeah, so if anybody else has worked on this or has interesting alternative thoughts to the ones that I presented, I'd be interested in talking. Thank you. All right.